So we have been discussing MAHA. So this new movement, this health revolution that is supposed to take place now under this new administration and under the helm of Robert F. Kennedy. And it turns out that the other day he got confirmed on February 13th. He got confirmed to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So we're going to continue to discuss that. What does this mean? What is his agenda? What can we expect? So I want to have that conversation. He has already kind of picked a couple of fights, and maybe not advertently. They might be inadvertent, accidental fights, but they will be fights nonetheless. I think that's what we have to look forward to. So let's get into it a little bit. On the 13th, he did get confirmed. The vote was 52 to 48 in the Senate. There was only one senator who went against party lines, and that was Mitch McConnell. Now, that speaks to a bigger issue. I have to tell you, I've been open about this. I have said that I wanted Kennedy to get this nomination, flaws and all. I think it's ultimately going to be for the best. And McConnell voted against him. He went against party lines to vote against him. And yet I kind of feel like, well, he might be the only one who is actually doing his job as far as vetting and as far as his constitutional duty of advise and consent. When the president nominates somebody, they have to go through this process, and they're not supposed to just be let on through. Like, the door is not supposed to be opened up. If a legislator is going to live up to their responsibility, they are going to be harsh. They are going to question the individual. Now, I'm sure that some people might say that McConnell has another agenda. Maybe he does. Maybe he receives a lot of money from the pharmaceutical lobby. That is very possible. Everything is on the table, but it's concerning to me that everyone votes along party lines. And we've discussed this. Like, how are we supposed to get any movement when, one side of the aisle is going to be pro everything, the other side of the aisle is going to be anti everything? How are we supposed to change anything for the better? I mean, it's always about power, right? It's never about what's correct. It's never about what's best. And that's a problem. And we're going to talk about incentives and incentive structures, because this is the whole issue if we ever want to make changes in healthcare in this country. Okay. But Bobby has the nomination, and he has a very strong agenda. He wants to fix healthcare in this country, and he wants to focus on a few things in particular. He wants to focus on our epidemic of chronic disease, specifically obesity. Obesity is now about 50% among adults. Obesity plus overweight is about 70%. And children, it's, I believe, 25%. So he's very well aware of this. And it's something that he really wants to focus on. Now, he also wants to address the factors that make it difficult to do so. So when we talk about the food industry, there are some aberrated incentives. There are some reverse incentives for the food industry. There should be incentives for creating the most healthful food possible. And yet it turns out that we subsidize the foods that are leading to our health and obesity epidemics. We subsidize, all of these hyper processed foods. And then we feed them to children as part of a federal program, which is a good federal program. I mean, kids have to eat. But if we're going to feed them, shouldn't we be feeding them good, healthful food? There needs to be a conversation about what food actually is. And if there's going to be future legislation, it should be along those lines. We should be able to have a firm definition about what food is and what isn't, because what food isn't is anything that can be ingested. A lot of things can be ingested that are not necessarily food. Ask a baby or your dog. All right. So there is a definition to food. Food is that which nourishes, it's that which gives our body the raw materials for healing and for building matter in our bodies for regeneration. And that's what food actually is. So there are things that aren't food, and these things that aren't food that we tend to ingest, hyper processed things, things like sugar, which starts out, I guess, as food. Most things do. These we need to have a discussion, I believe, about whether or not they should be legal. Like, why are we legalizing substances that have no nutritional value and have a negative nutritional value, right? They're contributing to all of these issues. I'm not saying absolutely that they should be, they are now. We tend to defer to choice in this nation, and people should have choice, but half the things that are in the food serve some other purposes, right? They might be serving the purpose of being preservatives, or they might be serving the purpose of getting people addicted to particular products. And these things have been documented. We've discussed it in the past. But there needs to be a conversation about that, about why there are 10,000 chemicals allowed in our foods here, and there are like 400 allowed in Europe, and a lot of the things that we allow here are just patently illegal over there. And they not only that, but culturally, they wouldn't even think to do it, right? But we have a very strong food and agricultural lobby, and to not be entirely critical, right? To kind of play devil's advocate with my position, and maybe to play into their position and to validate them a little bit. It's hard to feed a country. It's a big effort to feed a country, and it's very expensive. And what would happen if our food, the cost of our food, went up by 50% after what we just have seen in the last few years? So that probably has to be considered, but it's a conversation that needs to happen. And I believe it will be happening under RFK Jr.'s administration as the Secretary of HHS. Okay. So, like I said, disappointed that everyone seems to vote along party lines. That is not their job. It is not a job to be purely pro or purely. It's their job to do what's best for the American people. And I think they've lost that thread. They've forgotten what their purpose is regarding that. And again, it has to do with My default is not that there's a conspiracy going on. Uh, Sometimes it's just bad wiring. And I think that's the case here, but we can never swear to it, right? Speaking about these somewhat controversial subjects here. So there is a chance that the responsibility for my internet going out belongs to they. They did this. They do things like this. No, we're not going to put it on they. They have had enough trouble over the last few years, and I expect at any minute they to be perp walked into the local police station or FBI uh, headquarters, and they will pay a big price, especially for what they just did to me. All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. So we are discussing Maha. There was a commission created. The commission was created right after Kennedy was announced, or possibly before, but it was announced right after Kennedy was confirmed or sworn in. And the Maha Commission is very interesting. It's going to be headed up by Bobby. And essentially, they're going to start out by looking at chronic disease. The purpose of this Maha Commission is to fix healthcare in this country by looking at various issues. First priority is chronic disease. And one of the things that's interesting about this commission and about Bobby's approach to all of this is that the commission itself consists of heads of all kinds of department and government. So there are economic departments that are part of it, and there are, there's the food and agriculture, and there are the various medical departments, be they the NIH, etc. So there are all these things, and there are these disparate groups, and you wouldn't even expect some of them to be on there. But the understanding is that disease is multifactorial and that we have to look at everything. It's very much a holistic view. And that creates a bit of a problem, right? It is certainly a philosophical difference of opinion. What creates disease? Are we attacked by organisms and that's it, period? Or are we weakened by certain conditions, by the foods that we eat and the chemicals in the environment and different medications and spiritual factors? And that is, in fact, what RFK Jr. suggested. He was interviewed on a news program, and he said that we have a spiritual crisis in this country, especially among young people, and that spiritual crisis intersects with our healthcare crisis. So you see, you can't look at these things in isolation. And he suggested that the spiritual crisis is a crisis of connection, lack of connection, purposelessness among young people. And that's one of the things that we're going to look at and try to address. And that brought a smile to my face because we talked about this a few weeks ago. We talked about this town in Pennsylvania called Roseto, I believe, where they did this big heart study. And what they discovered was that in this particular town, people were not getting heart disease, and they were able to control for various factors, genetics and diet and all these things that we would expect. And it turns out that the reason they were healthier than others is because they had a very tight-knit, interconnected community. Connection is good for us. Connection is good for our immune system. Here we see, if not a causation, we definitely see a correlation between that kind of community connection and also physical health. And it's really fascinating. And, Mr. Kennedy is aware of this, and he does want to address this. But there is a problem. There are many problems with this, right? Immediately, it comes into conflict with a lot of things. First of all, as far as all the, health nerds go, all the scientists and researchers and doctors, it's hard to quantify that stuff, isn't it? It's hard to measure it. And that's what they do. That's what they look at. In fact, their whole approach says, well, if it cannot be measured, if it cannot be observed in a way that's measurable, then it really doesn't exist. And so it's much easier to measure things like blood tests. And this is what modern healthcare is about. This is, where they've kind of what they've emphasized, right? Is they've emphasized a very strict empirical scientific approach to the exclusion of all else. Well, if there are spiritual problems that are ultimately leading to physical problems, well, it does make sense for those to be addressed. Now, those things, of course, can be studied as well. The gap can be bridged, but there's no pill for it. So here's the other problem is that there's no financial incentive for it. So if you are if you've thrown your hat in with the pharmaceutical industry or the people who view the world and health in that way, there's nothing that can be done for it, at least from an institutional medical perspective, right? I mean, generally, when you go to see your doctor, he does not write a prescription for community involvement. He does not write a prescription for having purpose. He doesn't say, okay, your purpose is to heal the world. Here you go. All right, do this, and you could expect your cholesterol to improve. That's not the expectation. That does not happen. So again, by just bringing this up, as true and factual as it might be, it is going to create some conflict. He's going to have to find a way to not only articulate this point of view, but to execute upon it. And he could get into trouble for that. What if he's recommending things that are spiritually based and are desired by some people, but by other people they're not? What if he says really everyone should meditate every day? Meditation, that's an Eastern kind of a religious approach. And it kind of runs into conflict with our Western approach, which is really more about praying and tithing and things like that. So there could be a battle there. And what about the whole idea of small government, which is this administration's come from? It would run, directly into that, right? So these are kind of some of the interesting storylines that we need to look at. There's a big purpose here, and there's a what I would think of as a reasonable approach. Now, of course, I would think of it as a reasonable approach because I look at things holistically also. But that's not how our country runs. That's not how our healthcare system runs, right? But we, those people who are holistically oriented, would argue, well, that's why we get so shitty results. Bobby pointed out something that I pointed out last week. He said we're 4.2% of the world's population. We spend 70% on the drugs, right? 70% of all drug purchases, or at least the money spent on it, is from this country. So 4%, 70%, right? So you would expect we'd be the healthiest country in the world, better living through chemistry. But it turns out that we're the least healthy country among the industrialized nations, right? So something there is not working. And again, he's very much aware of that, and that's part of what he wants to address. Now, he understands also if we're going to address that, we have to do it within the context of individual choice, because you could theoretically mandate things that are good for people, but they might resist that. This whole idea of identifying foods and chemicals that are bad for us, I mean, the next logical step would be to get rid of them. However, people tend to react to that, right? The perfect example is several years ago, pardon me, in New York City, Mayor Bloomberg said, hey, these sugary drinks are killing us. They're driving up the cost of healthcare in the city. They're causing all kinds of problems. So what we're going to do is we are going to legislate against drinking sugary drinks that are too large. right? Sodas. We're gonna cap the size of the sodas that you can have. And people were up in arms. They were like, "Who the hell are you? Tell me what size big gulp I can have." And there was a point. There was a point. So what do you do then if legislation takes away liberty, but what you're legislating against is demonstrably bad for health outcomes? What do you do? I have a personal, I'm bumping into my mic. I have a thought about that, and I think this is the model that we need to use. Cigarettes. Have you been to Europe lately, or the Middle East, or countries where they're still smoking like crazy? I'm old enough to remember that, being in a movie theater and people were smoking, and being in an airplane and people were smoking. And apparently, I don't remember this, but apparently they would smoke in hospitals. Doctors would smoke while they were examining their patients. I mean, this could explain a lot about how I turned out. Can you imagine? My mother's in front of this guy pregnant and he's blowing smoke into her face. You don't think that got into me? Of course, I could have been normal. But now in this country, nobody smokes, hardly. And it's a pleasure when you understand it, when you compare it to what it was like coming home from a bar or restaurant, and your clothes and your hair just stink and your eyes are tearing from all that crap in your face. You can still find this, I think, in casinos, right? Don't go to casinos. So you realize what a pleasure it is to breathe freely. How did that happen? How were we able to kind of get rid of smoking? It's not illegal. It's still legal, at least in certain places, right? Uh, it is illegal in some places. So it's not criminal, but it is kind of illegal, right? You can't just light up in indoors in a restaurant. In most states, that's I guess, still a statewide thing. But but something happened, something changed from the time that everyone was smoking everywhere to now. And it was a combination, it seems to me, of legal and cultural. And legally, here's what happened. From my understanding, and I should do further research on this, but this is from my memory and my understanding, is several things happened. First of all, uh, people were isolated. Smokers were isolated, right? There were people advocating for smokers' rights, but there is no right to pollute the air. So they were put into places. I distinctly remember in airports, there were these rooms, and they had glass walls, and you looked in there and it was disgusting. The whole place was gray with smoke. I don't know how anyone could go in there. So that isolation was one thing, right? And you still see it today. People want to smoke, they go outside, so that was helpful. And there was a kind of shaming that I think was probably effective as well. But secondly, there was a sin tax. Two separate words, sin tax. We're not talking about, whatever syntax is with grammar. So there was an extra tax put on these cigarettes. And then that's the middle ground that I like when it comes to these liberty issues versus what's best for us, right? And that's a scary topic when other people decide what's best, but we know certain things are unhealthy, right? So I like the idea of a sin tax. It makes sense. I personally don't think that is, and people will argue this, and I have had arguments about this, but I personally don't think that that's a big encroachment on our liberties. I think that's more of an acknowledgement of consequences, right? If people are smoking, if everyone is smoking, and obviously cancer is going to go up, so it makes sense to have a bigger tax on the cigarettes, so that could help with the extra costs of the cancer that people will inevitably develop, right? And if the extra cost proves to be a disincentive to smoking, Well, so much the better. And I think that's exactly what happened. So it would be great if we can kind of study that model. Like, why? Because as far as I know, I don't know that there's ever been a war that's been as effective as that. The war on cigarettes. There was also legislation. They got hit with fines. There were black box warnings that it was mandated that they put on the cartons of cigarettes. There was a whole bunch of things that happened. I don't know that the war on drugs has been as effective. The war on drugs was a different kind, right? There was no sin tax per se, but it was more of an attempted suppression of them. Now that's changed in various states. In various states, drugs have been, or certain drugs have been decriminalized or made legal. And so it's still happening, obviously. Now, I wonder what the taxes are on these particular drugs, on marijuana. Are they high? They should be, in my opinion. They should be high. So that's a comfortable middle ground for me, not for everybody. And it remains to be seen if that's going to happen, because as I said before, we do have these perverse incentives whereby we are subsidizing the bad food. We're not doing that for the good food. Shouldn't we be subsidizing the organic farmers, if anything? This is what I'm talking about. It's an unfortunate state of affairs that we can't necessarily rely on the ethics of the people who are making money. Right? We can't rely on an agricultural executive or an executive for an agricultural company or a food company to make good, healthful food if they could sell more unhealthful food. Right? We've learned that. And let's not even get into what's done to our livestock. Right? It makes sense from a very capitalist point of view. It makes sense, right? You can, if you treat them worse, the animals, the livestock, you can make more of a profit. What do I mean by that? We'll pump them up with steroids, antibiotics. Don't give them enough space to explore. Give them cheaper feed. That all gets into their bodies and ultimately into our bodies. So RFK Jr. understands this about incentives. And I'm going to tell you something else. I'm going to give you a litmus test by which to think. And this goes not only for RFK Jr., this goes not only for anyone who's involved in regulating aspects that affect our health in government. This goes for just government in general. I'm going outside my scope. But the litmus test is this. It's not enough to reform. It's not enough to fire and get rid of, I don't know, maybe agencies that aren't working. That's not enough. Like now, if they're really egregiously bad and really not doing what they're supposed to do, it makes sense to get rid of them. But it's not enough. You have to change the incentive structures, because if they don't change, then whatever replaces it is going to be the same thing, or whomever replaces it. You can fire everyone in a department, but ultimately, whoever replaces them, if they are given the same incentives, the same conditioning, they're going to do the same things. Right? If you think an industry is corrupt, if you think there are CEOs of food companies, okay, good, put them all in jail. Obviously, that's extreme, right? They have to have broken a law, but let's just say theoretically, put them all in jail. Well, if you're still incentivizing them and subsidizing them to make unhealthful food, the next guy is going to do the same thing. Most of them are not going to choose altruism. Some might, which means that they get out of the industry because they are not they are not serving the stockholders, and they are vitalating. They are violating their fiduciary responsibility to the stakeholders. So that's what we're looking at as far as incentives go, and as far as things that must be done. I believe that Bobby is aware of all of this, but there are going to be lawsuits, and they're going to be coming soon, and they're going to be coming hard. Okay. One of the things that he mentioned, one of the first things that he mentioned, and again, he just started, so he's only done so much, but a public statement of his was talking about SSRIs. SSRIs are a class of medications. They are a psychiatric medication. And he was saying we need to look into these medications. Okay. He was saying that, there are problems or potential problems with this medication, with this class of medication. We need to know more. Now, there's going to be pushback. The medical psychiatric community is going to push back, probably in courts, if Bobby takes action to regulate or to try to do away with these types of medications. These types of medications are highly profitable. They are also highly controversial. First and foremost, because studies show that, at least in some cases, when we're talking about depression, they are no better than placebos. When we're talking about like mid to moderate depression, that's what was shown by studies, right? But they're still being pushed. The other problem is that they're totally based on a theory which may or may not be fallacious, and that is the theory that there are imbalances in brain chemicals. Never been proven. No tests, as far as I know, has ever been done to look at that brain chemistry. It's purely a theory, a hypothesis that's never been proven. So the test is purely symptomatic. These are purely symptomatic medications. And some people, symptoms get better, and some people, they get worse. Right? So that is a problem that's inherent in this type of medication. And there's going to be big battles, or there's the potential for big battles about this. So what am I doing? I'm kind of laying out the field and giving you some things to expect, and telling you what this new movement, which may or may not reform healthcare. That's certainly the purpose. That's certainly the goal. And there's certainly a plan to do it, an aggressive plan, but it is going to be slowed, maybe to a crawl or a halt. And that's what we have to look forward to. So I'm going to give updates. There's a lot to talk about when we discuss this. I don't have to tell you that we live in a very polarized nation. You have half the people in this country who are thrilled about RFK Jr., who was celebrating on February 13th when he was confirmed. They think that this is the start of a revolution, that we have been poisoned and prodded and manipulated for too long. Mothers are very often behind this movement. They love Bobby. The moms love Bobby. At least the holistic moms do. On the other hand, half the country thinks that this guy's a complete nutter, and that he is going to cause a lot of problems and potentially kill a lot of people. I mean, it's amazing that so many people are looking at the same thing and seeing it with such different eyes and have such a different bias on it. So you have people celebrating, you have people screaming. And it very much breaks down along these philosophical lines along several philosophical lines, right? Orthodoxy versus somebody who questions the system. That's one of the lines. Holism, or a holistic way of looking at health, versus our traditional medical model. Entrenched interests versus those fighting the power. So there are these lines, right? And this is how this is kind of shaping up. So we're going to find out what happens. I try to take a mostly middle ground position, though my training is in a holistic discipline. So my bias, to the degree that it exists, is for holism and for the things that Bobby is promoting. And that just makes sense. And I won't present it any other way because that's what's true for me. Even though I hope I can be honest and candid enough and objective enough to present some of the potential downsides. I mean, I've been candid about Bobby that he, has demons. He's just one guy, but he is the leader of this movement, right? There is a messianic quality here among some people, among the ones who don't think he's the devil. Okay, so I will be updating everyone on this. I've spoken about this several times now. My hypothesis that I articulated last week and several weeks before is that this is a topic. Obviously, it's a discussion we need to have, but beyond that, the understanding was that, well, health is kind of an individual thing. You can choose to be healthy or choose not to be healthy. This is also the rationalization of a lot of these companies. Hey, we present you with our highly processed poisonous food, but you don't have to eat it. And it's true enough, but it's burdensome. And this can't be just about this. Again, this is my hypothesis. Not that it can't be. It certainly can be. But we're seeing the results in our country, right? Where everyone's sick chronically. That it has to be a top-down thing as well. It can't be just about individual choice. Can't be a bottom-up movement by some pissed-off, mothers and holistic advocates. There needs to be some oversight by the government. It's just too hard and too burdensome to put it all on individual choice because we may not have as much choice as we think. Because not everything is on the up and up. There's problems with labeling. There are problems with transparency. There are problems with disclosure. So those problems need to be addressed. So this is the hypothesis. This is why this subject matters. There is also the understanding that we all had hammered home to us during COVID, which is that the macro does affect the micro. We are affected by our environment. We are affected by the choices other people make. We are affected by the incentive structures that do exist in our society. So that's why this all matters and why I'm harping on it. And I will probably continue to do so, like I said, at least at the level of updates, because it is interesting how this will play out. There's a problem that's been going on now. And when I say this, I mean the increase in chronic disease, things like obesity, our food supply is a problem that exists for basically since the 1980s. I mean, things got much worse in the 1980s. Statistically, health outcomes really started changing, certainly with respect to overweight and obesity. Okay, so I'm going to stop rambling. Hope it's useful. If you have any questions, let me know. If you have any ideas, one thing we haven't spoken about is what we can do and advocacy. and dissemination and things like that. So that is a conversation that we could have as well. If we do have that conversation, I might have other people on, because there are probably other people who are better at discussing it than I am. All right. So have a great week, everybody. Take care.